Well, hello, dear friends. Thank you so much for joining us for our worship service sermon today. We have a very fascinating study that we're going to take a look at. The title is God's Unfailing Purposes. Now, before we actually have a word of prayer to ask the Lord's blessing in our study, I just want to announce that General Conference is coming up very soon. It's going to be from July 3 through July 12 of this year in the city of St. Louis. Secrets Unsealed is planning on being there. We're going to have a booth. It's booth number 107, where there's a lot of things that are going to be going on there. We're going to have materials for purchase. We're also going to be producing there, before your very eyes, programs such as I'd Like to Know, Me Gustaría Saber in Spanish, and our Sabbath School Hour, both in English and in Spanish. We're going to have correspondents who are going to be going across the floor and try to interview and get testimonies of how God has worked in your life. There's going to be a lot of activity in our booth, and so we want to encourage you, if you're planning on going to General Conference, to stop by and visit and get acquainted with all of our staff. Practically every single person that works at Secrets Unsealed is going to be there at our booth. We would love to meet you and hear your testimony, and so please join us. We'd be very pleased to have the privilege of meeting you. Now we want to have a word of prayer and ask the Lord to bless our study together. Father in heaven, we come before your awesome and powerful throne, the throne of the King of the universe, who is in control of human history, to be with us in our study today. Through the Holy Spirit, we ask that you will enlighten our minds, you will soften our heart, that we might live in harmony with your plan. We thank you for the privilege of prayer and for answering, for we ask it in the precious and holy name of Jesus. Amen. I want to begin by reading from Ephesians chapter 6 and verses 11 and 12. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 to 12. We're going to see here that there is a battle going on between two forces in the world that we cannot see. Satan is on one side, and God, Christ, is on the other side. And they are struggling throughout history to implement their plans. We're going to see that God's plan will ultimately prevail, and today we're going to study the reason why. So let's read Ephesians 6, verses 11 and 12, where that battle is described vividly. It says there, "Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." And then we are told to put on the whole armor of God as protection. Now, as we begin, I want to ask a question. What is it that distinguishes the true God from all pretenders, from all of those who claim to be but are not? The answer is found in Isaiah chapter 46 and verses 9 through 11. So let's read those verses, and we're going to see two great points that God makes here in these verses. It says in verse 9, God is speaking, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me." Now the question is, why can God say this? Why does he say, "I'm God, there's no other, and there's none like me"? Verse 10 has the answer to the question. "Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done." That is the omniscience of God, the all-knowingness of God. "Saying, my counsel," another word for that is plan, "my counsel or plan shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man who executes my counsel," that is my plan, "from a far country. Indeed, I have spoken it. I will bring it to pass. I will also do it. Two great points that I want to make from this passage. Number one, God is omniscient. He knows the end from the beginning. He has contemplated everything that has ever happened in eternity past, in the present, or in eternity future, as if it were taking place right now. And because God knows everything, there is no possibility that His plan can fail, because He knows exactly how Satan is going to work, so He can take steps to counteract the moves that Satan makes. Now, I want to read a couple of statements from the writings of Ellen White about the difference between God's concept of time and our concept of time. The first statement is in Desire of Ages, page 606. I added this one to the sermon that I presented in Spanish today as well. It says there, God counts the things that are not as though they were. So God counts the things that are not as though they were. He sees the end from the beginning and beholds the result of His work as though it were now accomplished. And then she's speaking here about a text that we're going to read in a few moments. The precious dead, from Adam down to the last saint who dies, will hear the voice of the Son of God and will come forth from the grave to immortal life. God will be their God, and they will be His people. There will be a close and tender relationship between God and the risen saints. Now, notice she uses the future tense because she's speaking about our perspective of time. All these things will happen in the future. But now notice God's concept. This condition, which is anticipated in His purpose, God beholds as if it were already existing. The dead live unto Him. In other words, for God, the dead are no longer dead. The resurrection is a done deal, in other words, because God sees history in a panoramic view as if it's all taking place in the presence. That's the reason why He is called the I Am. Now, the second statement I want to read deals exactly with that, with the meaning of the word or the expression I am. This is found from Manuscript Releases, Volume 14, pages 22 and 23. It's a quotation written by Ellen White. She's explaining what I am means. I am means an eternal presence. That's not our concept of time. She continues, the past, present, and future are alike to God. They're not alike to us. We distinguish past, present, and future. We look at history in segments. She continues, He, that is God, sees the most remote events of past history and the far distant future with as clear a vision as we do those things that are transpiring daily. An amazing statement. In other words, God sees everything as if it is happening before His eyes right now. Now, I want to read a passage that we find in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 20, verses 33. Actually, we'll start at verse 34. Verse 34 through verse 38, where here Jesus is speaking to the Sadducees who did not believe in the resurrection. And by the way, the quotation that I read from Desire of Ages 606, Ellen White is making her commentary about this passage in Luke 20, 34 through 38. Let me just give you a little bit of context here. The Sadducees came to Jesus. They did not believe in the resurrection, and they wanted to put Jesus between a rock and a hard place. And so they gave this ridiculous scenario where 7 men marry the same woman. And they asked Jesus, who would be her husband of the 7 in the resurrection? They were actually making fun of the doctrine of the resurrection, and they wanted to get Jesus in a difficult situation. Now we're going to read the answer that Jesus gave. He gives 3 reasons why they're wrong. Number 1, they ignore the power of God. God is powerful. He's omnipotent. He can resurrect the dead. Number 2, they don't even understand the scriptures that they claim to believe in. You see, they only believe that the 5 books of Moses were fully inspired. They held the rest of the Old Testament to be of lesser value. And so they said the resurrection is not in the writings of Moses, so we can't accept the doctrine of the resurrection. Jesus says, you ignore the scriptures. And the third reason is that in the kingdom to come, there is not going to be any marriage. So your example is worthless because there's not going to be any marriage in the coming kingdom, which means that none of the 7 brothers is going to be married to this woman. Let's read the passage as Jesus answered the objection of the Sadducees. Jesus answered and said to them, the sons of this age marry. In other words, those who live in this present world marry and are given in marriage. But those who are counted worthy to attain to that age, in other words, to the kingdom to come in the future, and the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are given in marriage, nor can they die anymore, for they are equal to the angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. So he says, no marriage in the future, so your example is worthless. And then Jesus is going to talk about their misunderstanding of the scriptures. They say Moses didn't talk about the resurrection. We can't accept it. Jesus is going to say, I'm going to show you that Moses actually believed in the resurrection. And therefore, you don't understand the scriptures that you claim to accept. Notice how this statement in the Gospel of Luke ends. Verse 37. But even Moses, notice he uses the word even Moses, in whom you claim to believe, showed in the burning bush passage that the dead are raised, when he called the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. For he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. Now, when Jesus spoke these words, and even when Moses spoke the words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were dead. So for Moses and for Jesus, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at this point were dead, but not for God, because God lives in an eternal present. God doesn't have to wait to resurrect Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from the dead, because he lives in an eternal present. Now, let's go to the passage that Jesus referred to. And remember, the key part is verse 38. For he, that is God, is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. That's the reason why the person who appeared in the burning bush, who is actually Christ, said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He didn't say, I was their God when they were alive. No, he says, I am. And of course, the verse ends by saying, all live to him. Now, let's go to the passage that Jesus referred to. Exodus 3, verse 6, and then we'll jump down to verses 13 and 14. Verse 6 says, moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now remember, at this point, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are dead. But God is saying, I am their God. Let's continue reading here. It says, and Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Now let's jump down to verse 13. Then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you." Notice God doesn't say I was. He didn't say I will be. He says I am. Because God lives in an eternal present. God does not look at the flow of time like we do, in segments, but rather as a present, continuous flow that He's seen transpiring at the very moment before His eyes. You see, God does not look at history and prophecy as what has happened and what will happen, but rather as a continual present flow. This is impossible for us human beings to fathom because we are not God. So, from our perspective, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were already dead when God spoke to Moses and to Jesus, and Jesus spoke to the Sadducees. But for God, they were alive because He is the I Am who lives in an eternal present. In other words, for us, the resurrection is a hope. But for Christ, for God the Father, it is already a done deal. He doesn't have to wait for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to resurrect because He sees that in the present flow of time. Now, we're going to take a story from the Old Testament to illustrate what we have just taken a look at. God, being in control of history, seeing everything that will transpire simultaneously at the same time. We're going to take a look at the story of Joseph. His life is a living illustration of someone who cooperated with God, who knows the end from the beginning, step by step. He did not understand God's methods, but he knew that God had a plan. So let's review some of the highlights of the life of Joseph. You know, Joseph was a good kid. He was not like his brothers. He had a good character. He was a nice boy. However, his brothers hated him primarily because his father gave him a coat of many colors, and especially because of the dreams that Joseph had, that his brothers and his father would come and bow before him. Those two dreams were the dream of the sun, moon, and stars bowing to Joseph, and 11 sheaves bowing to Joseph's sheaf. And so his brothers understood what the dreams meant. His brother said, "Are we going to come and are we going to bow before you? Don't you even think that that's going to happen." And so they hated him so much. God knew this from eternity. For God, it was happening at that very moment. He knew that his brothers were so angry at him that they would be selling him into slavery. And that's exactly what happened. His brothers, because of their hatred, sold Joseph into slavery. And so now, his brothers think those dreams are never going to be fulfilled. But let me tell you, when God reveals something in a dream, it's going to happen, because for him, basically, it has already happened. And so his brothers say, the dreams will not be fulfilled. And of course, the one behind his brothers is Satan. He's influencing the brothers to sell Joseph to Egypt. Now, at first, we're told that Joseph was terrified when he was on his way to Egypt with the Ishmaelites. In fact, Ellen White tells us that he could see the tents of his father in the distance. And he had a very dire foreboding of what was going to take place. But on the way, he made up his mind that though he did not understand God's methods, God's plan, he would go along with the plan, because God knows the end from the beginning. In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 214, Ellen White wrote about Joseph's resolve to be faithful to God's plan no matter what came his way. It says, his soul thrilled with the high resolve to prove himself true to God, under all circumstances, to act as became a subject of the King of heaven. He would serve the Lord with undivided heart. He would meet the trials of his lot with fortitude and perform every duty with fidelity. Joseph didn't have any idea how his dreams would be fulfilled because he was sold to Egypt. How could his brothers ever come to bow before him? But he knew that God had a plan, and he resolved that he was going to follow the plan. And at the end, he would know where God was leading. God knew from eternity that Joseph was going to end in Potiphar's house. God did not determine it that way, but God knew that it was going to happen. And what was the reason why Joseph ended up in Potiphar's house? Well, because Joseph had to become a good administrator, because God had a great administrative project for him in the future, and that is to distribute the food in the years of famine in Egypt. For that, he had to learn to be a meticulous administrator, and he did in Potiphar's house. Because we're told that Potiphar didn't have to worry about anything except the food that was on his table. And then God knew that Potiphar's wife was going to make passes at Joseph. God knew that. He allowed Satan to act upon this woman to try to entice Joseph into committing adultery. But Joseph had made plans to be faithful to God's plan. He knew that adultery was wrong, and so he resisted. He didn't give in. God knew from eternity that Potiphar's wife was going to accuse Joseph of rape, and he allowed Satan to do it. He's giving Satan just enough rope to eventually hang himself, as we're going to see as we study along. And so now Joseph is accused by Potiphar's wife, and he ends up in prison. God knew that he was going to end up in prison, and God had a plan to counteract what Satan was doing. Remember, history is a play and counterplay between Christ and Satan. Each plays, but Christ is going to win because he knows all of the moves that Satan is going to make, and therefore he takes steps to counteract what Satan is going to do in human history. So Joseph ends up in prison. Why does he end up in prison? Imagine this. He's a good kid. And he's a good son to his father. And because he's such a good son, he's sold into slavery. And then because he's faithful to the seventh commandment, he ends up in prison. It would have been very easy for him to say, what use is it to serve God? What use is it to follow in the paths of God? Look, I'm obedient to God, and look what happens. But Joseph made up his mind that God had a plan, because God knows the end from the beginning. Now, why did he end up in prison? Well, first of all, because he had to fine-tune his administrative abilities. By the way, he became such a good administrator that the jailer said, why don't you be the jailer, basically. And so Joseph became a meticulous administrator, very capable administrator by being in prison. But there was a second reason why he had to end up in prison. And that is because he had to meet a baker and he had to meet a cupbearer. And of course, God gave the cupbearer and he gave the baker dreams. God is revealing what he already knows. It's already a done deal for God. There's no possibility that it can't happen, what God is revealing. And so these men have dreams, and they can't get any meaning out of the dreams. And so they say to Joseph, we've had these dreams. And Joseph says, well, let me ask the Lord. And the Lord helps Joseph to interpret the dreams. Basically, Joseph says to the baker, I'm sorry, but in 3 days you're going to hang, you're going to die. And he said to the cupbearer, good news for you, because you're going to serve Pharaoh's wine again. He had to meet those men in prison. And of course, God gave those dreams because later on in the story, Pharaoh is going to be impressed with this young man who was able to interpret these dreams in prison. So he ends up in prison, but God counteracts Satan and says, I'll give these dreams, and I'm preparing the way for Pharaoh calling Joseph to interpret his dreams. It's amazing how you have this play and counterplay in this story. So then, the baker dies in 3 days, and the cupbearer is called to serve Pharaoh's wine again. And lo and behold, the cupbearer forgets Joseph for 2 years, even though Joseph said, put in a good word for me. But he didn't. He forgot Joseph. Why? Because it wasn't time yet. You see, God has a timing for this. He allowed Joseph to stay in prison for another 2 years, and then after the 2 years, God jogs the memory of the cupbearer, and he says, it's time. It's time now to mention Joseph. And you know how the story transpires. God gives Pharaoh also 2 dreams. And basically the gist of the dreams is that there are going to be 7 years of glorious bounty, agricultural bounty in Egypt. And it's going to be followed by 7 years of severe famine. And that a preparation needs to be made during the 7 years of plenty for the 7 years of famine. Of course, Pharaoh doesn't understand his dreams. And so he calls all the wise men to interpret the dreams, and God knew that they were going to be unmasked as charlatans because they could not tell the king or the Pharaoh what the dreams meant. So the Pharaoh is at odds end, and he says, what are we going to do? I need to know these dreams. They're prophetic dreams. I need to know what they mean. And so then God says to the cupbearer, okay, it's time. It's time for me to counteract what the devil has been doing. And so the cupbearer says, I know an individual who can interpret the dreams. And Pharaoh says, oh yeah, where is he? Well, he's in prison. In prison? Yeah, and then the cupbearer told how Joseph interpreted the dream of the baker and his own dream. And the Pharaoh says, what are we waiting for? Call the young man and bring him here. And so Joseph now comes before the Pharaoh to interpret his dreams. And now God is going to give Joseph the gift of interpreting dreams to counteract what Satan has planned to do. History is a play and counterplay. Satan is working at a great disadvantage because Satan has to guess why God is doing what he's doing, but God already knows from eternity past what Satan was going to do in the course of history. And so Joseph comes and he interprets the dreams of Pharaoh. And from a foreign slave and prisoner, Joseph becomes second in command in all of Egypt. He becomes, so to speak, the prime minister of Egypt. Things are looking up for Joseph. He's saying, I'm sure glad that I'm following God's plans, but my dreams have not yet been fulfilled. They have to be fulfilled. There's too much evidence that God already knows everything that's going to happen, so I can be sure that these dreams that I had at the beginning when I was at home are going to be fulfilled. But they haven't been fulfilled yet. Well, the story continues. 7 years of plenty. Joseph, with his administrative skills, gathers all the grain of Egypt, preparing for the years of famine. Then the years of famine come. A severe famine, not only in Egypt, but it reached all the way into Canaan. 2 years passed. Things were very serious in Canaan. Jacob said to his sons, we are all going to die of hunger, and our posterity is going to disappear. God promised a numerous posterity for Abraham, but it looks like it's not going to be fulfilled because we are suffering hunger. But I've heard that in Egypt there are provisions. So why don't you go down to Egypt and try and get some food so that our descendants live? And so his sons go down to Egypt. And of course, at this point, Joseph has grown up. He was probably around 18 years of age when he left home, but he's become older. He speaks perfect Egyptian, and also he's all dressed up with all of the regalia of that Pharaoh gave him, so they don't recognize him, that he's their brother. And the first thing that they do when they come before Joseph is bow before him. And now Joseph says, oh, God really has a sense of humor. Here my dream is being fulfilled. Oh, but my father hasn't come to bow yet. So how am I to understand that my father hasn't come yet? Because my dream said my father also. So there's a part of the dream that has not yet been fulfilled. So now, did God know that Satan was going to cause a drought? Of course God knew that Satan was going to cause a drought. So God says, no problem. I'll give a dream two dreams to Pharaoh, that there's going to be plenty and there's going to be famine. And this way I'll counteract what Satan is doing and I'll save the holy race. Now, to make a long story short, Joseph's brothers bow before him, and in the long run, Joseph identifies himself to his brothers. And the story tells us that his brothers begin to cry. They say, oh, Joseph, we're so sorry that we did this to you. Please forgive us. And, maybe they're afraid that Joseph is going to get revenge for what they did to him. But Joseph 3 times says something very interesting. Let's go to Genesis chapter 45, verses 6 through 8. By the way, while you're looking for those verses, it was Satan's plan to wipe out the holy line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because at this point he already knew that the seed of Genesis 3:15 was going to be born, and he was going to crush his head. And he says, I'm going to nip this in the bud. I'm going to get rid of the entire race. A little later on, we're going to talk about the book of Esther. He tried to do the same thing there. So let's read Genesis 45, verses 6 through 8. Here Joseph is speaking to his brothers. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you have sold me here. Now comes the first time. For God sent me before you to preserve life. First time. God sent me here to preserve life. Of course, God allowed the devil to do it. And so God is doing it by allowing the devil to do it. Now, it continues saying, for these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. Now comes the second time. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity. Notice, to preserve the holy line from which the Messiah will come. God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. And now comes the third time. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. God knew that the brothers of Joseph would come to Egypt to get provisions, and that the story would continue as we have clearly revealed it. But there's something deeper here. There's something deeper than just saving Jacob and his family from starvation, and thus eliminating the holy line from which the Messiah would come. You see, God had given Abram a dream of a 400-year captivity. Let's read that dream that God gave to Abraham. It's found in Genesis chapter 15, and we will read verses 13 and 14. Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14. Then he said to Abram, Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. But notice that God did not identify the land that was not theirs. That is a significant detail. Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. God is predicting a 400 years period of slavery before it happens. But for God, it was already a done deal that it was going to happen, because God lives in an eternal present. In other words, there was no possibility that the 400-year prophecy would not transpire exactly the way God said. Because for God, He didn't have to wait for it to happen. In His infinite mind, He sees everything as if it is happening at this very moment. So, it says in verse 14, and also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward, they shall come out with great possessions. So get the picture. God is telling Abram that his descendants are going to go to a land that is not theirs. In other words, they're going to leave Canaan for some place. God does not identify the place. And He says that they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. And after the 400 years, God is going to deliver them from slavery, and He's going to take them back to the promised land. He's going to take them back to Canaan. Very, very interesting. Now, Satan didn't know which land it was, and that's very, very significant. Now, the question is, why didn't God leave Jacob and his family in Canaan? Why export them to Egypt? Well, here's where the story really gets interesting. You know, God knew very clearly that at that point in history, in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, His followers, which were few, would not be able to expel the nations from Canaan, who were very powerful nations. And He also knew that if the chosen race actually dispersed among those nations of Canaan, that they would be led into idolatry and they would lose their identity. So God said, I can't leave Jacob and his family in Canaan. They are too few. They're not going to be able to expel those powerful nations. Furthermore, if I say for them to disperse and to grow as a nation, they're going to lose their identity. So I am going to export them to a different land where they can grow, and then they can expel the nations from Canaan. Now, what the devil didn't know is that by exporting Joseph from Canaan to Egypt, he was allowing the prophecy of the 400 years to be fulfilled. Satan thought, I'm getting rid of this young man, Joseph. His dreams will never be fulfilled. And in exporting Joseph from Canaan to Egypt, and then Jacob and his family to Egypt, Satan, without realizing it, was helping the prophecy of the 400 years to be fulfilled. You know, God does have a sense of humor. Once again, it shows that Satan acts and God counteracts. Satan has to guess how God is going to act, but God knows exactly how Satan is going to act, and He can take steps to counteract the blocks that Satan puts in the way. Now, there's another very interesting detail, and that is that Israel ended up in this land of Goshen in Egypt. The question is, why in Goshen? Well, God solved the two problems that existed in Canaan at that time for Jacob and his family. Number one is that in Goshen, which was a very fertile area, isolated, they could grow into a great nation, which they did. Furthermore, because the Egyptians did not like sheep and they did not like shepherds, and the Israelites were shepherds, in other words, Jacob and his family were shepherds, the Egyptians would maintain themselves distant from the Hebrews. And in that way, the Hebrews would not be totally contaminated with the idolatry of Egypt. Notice how God has everything under control. There is no detail that escapes his attention. He counteracts Satan at every step. And so, Jacob and his family ended up in Goshen. They grew up into a great nation, and they did not become totally contaminated with the idolatry in Egypt. Now, when the 400 years came to an end, Satan realized that he really made a terrible mistake by exporting Joseph to Egypt. And so now he says, God said in the dream that he gave to Abraham that they were going to leave and they were going to go back to Canaan. Oh, and Satan is thinking, ooh, they're going back to Canaan. And now, from their posterity, the Messiah is going to come. So I need to keep them here. I can't let them go. Why do you suppose that Pharaoh was so hardened and just kept being so bullheaded to not let Israel go out of Egypt? It's because Satan is now trying to save face. Satan is saying, okay, the first part of the 400-year prophecy was fulfilled. They've grown into a large nation. They've kept aloof from serious idolatry of Egypt. But now I'm going to keep the last part of the 400-year prophecy from being fulfilled. I am going to keep them here in Egypt. And when several times God, through Moses and Aaron, said, let my people go, Pharaoh said, I will not let your people go. I do not recognize your God. But we all know the end of the story. God then fulfilled the last part of the 400-year prophecy. He took Israel and led them out of Egypt back to the promised land, as he had said he would to Abram 400 years before. And it happened to the very day, according to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40, that Israel left the land of Egypt exactly the very day that the 400-year prophecy came to an end. Is God in control of history, folks? God is in full control of history. Who rules in history? It is God who rules in history. Yes, there is a play and there is a counterplay, but ultimately God wins. Now, let's read a statement that probably we're pretty well acquainted with. This statement is found in Ministry of Healing. And Ellen White wrote this: God never leads his children otherwise than they would choose to be led if they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of the purpose which they are fulfilling as co-workers with him. This statement applies to Joseph very, very clearly. What is Ellen White saying? She's saying that if we could see the end from the beginning, is Joseph has seen everything that was going to happen and what the end would be, that he would save the race from which the Messiah would come, that he would help the prophecy of the 400 years to be fulfilled. Is Joseph saw that everything he went through was being orchestrated by God so that the Holy Line could be saved and the 400-year prophecy could be fulfilled. Do you think Joseph would have chosen any other path than the path that God chose for him? Of course not. Retrospect is 2020. God doesn't say, try and figure out what's going to happen in the future. He says, commit yourself to me, and you might have some bumps along the way, But at the end, when you look back, you're going to say, thank you, Lord, for doing it your way. That's the way it works. And that is what Ellen White is saying here. God never leads his children otherwise than they would choose to be led, if they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of the purpose which they are fulfilling as co-workers for him. Joseph fulfilled the purpose that God had for him as a co-worker with him. Do you think Joseph saw things differently at the end of his trial? As he looked at God's providential leading all the way through, he says, man, am I ever glad that I decided to follow God's plan? God's ways are beyond our understanding. Praise the Lord that I decided to follow his plan. Now let's take, before we end, another example of this from another story that we find in the Old Testament. Do you remember the story of Esther? King Ahasuerus, influenced by Haman, had given a decree to destroy every Jew in the kingdom, like Satan had wanted to starve the Holy Line to death. But this decree was given to get rid of all of the Jews, commit genocide. And of course, Satan is behind it. Ellen White wrote in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 601, Satan himself, the hidden instigator of the scheme, was trying to rid the earth of those who preserved the knowledge of the true God. And so Satan is making his move. Satan is saying, I'm going to commit genocide. I'm getting rid of the Holy Line from where the Messiah will come. But God says, oh, not so fast. Did God know that this was going to happen? Yes, it was as if it was happening right before his eyes, because God lives in an eternal present. He didn't have to wait until this happened, because it was going to happen exactly the way it did. God sees everything as if it's transpiring in panoramic view before him at any given moment. Now, what did God do to counteract what Satan had planned? Well, the answer is, he put Esther in the palace beforehand. See, God preempts. He puts Esther in the palace before this happens, because he knows that he's going to use Esther, and Esther will allow herself to be used. She will follow his purpose in order to deliver Israel from certain destruction. Let's go to Esther chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, where we find the gist of what we're looking at. Here, Mordecai and the people are going through a severe time of trouble, of mourning and weeping and crying out. Mordecai has torn his garments as a sign of abasement. And they're not certain about what's going to happen. So Mordecai now sends a message to Esther, the queen. They were relatives, by the way. And notice what Mordecai said to Esther. Verse 13 of Esther 4. Then Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. Don't think that because you're the queen, you're going to escape death. You're a Jew too. So it continues saying, for if you remain completely silent at this time, which God knew she wasn't. God knew she was going to cooperate with him. But for if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. All of us are important in fulfilling God's plan, but not indispensable. We are important in fulfilling God's plan, but we are not indispensable. If we don't go with God's plan, and God knows if we are going to or not, it's our decision whether we will or not. God knows if we will or we won't. And if we decide not to follow his plan, God will choose another way, but his plan will be fulfilled. Now, let's notice the last part of verse 14. I'm going to begin at the top of the verse again. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And now Mordecai asks the question. I would rephrase the question, but this is what he wrote. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? What he should have said is, you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Not who knows. Of course, we can't be too hard on Mordecai. They were under a death decree. But still, we know in hindsight that Esther was placed in the palace to deliver the Jews from genocide. Once again, this for God. God didn't have to wait till it happened. God lives in an eternal present. He is the I am. He sees this as if it is transpiring right before his eyes, just as the resurrection of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the end of time. God doesn't have to wait for it to happen. God, in panoramic view, sees it. It is absolutely certain that it is going to happen exactly like it is in his eternal mind. Now, the book of Esther is one of the 3 last books that were included in the Old Testament canon. The first was Ecclesiastes. It was considered to be too pessimistic. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Song of Solomon. It was considered to be a bit romantic to be included in the canon, but it was. And the book of Esther is one of the last as well. Why? Because it's the only book in the Bible that does not mention the name of God. And yet if you look at the story, you read the story, there are far too many coincidences for this to be happening by chance. Clearly, there are 2 powers that are working behind the scenes at the same time. God trying to deliver Israel and Satan trying to destroy Israel. Ephesians 6 is clear in this story of Esther. Now, I want to bring this to an end by reading a verse that undoubtedly many of those, if not most of those who are watching this program, know probably from memory. I'm referring to Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. And we know, it doesn't say we think, perhaps, maybe. The Apostle Paul says, we know that all things, both what appears to be good and that which is troubling, like in the story of Joseph. We know that all things work together for good. You look at the story of Joseph, everything is working together. We know that all things work together for good, not to everybody in the world, by the way, to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. In other words, those who are called to fulfill His purpose. They love God, and all things work together for good. The story of Esther shows it, the story of Joseph, and basically the entirety of Scripture. You see, history is like a game of chess. On one side of the board, Satan is seated, and on the other side of the board, Jesus is seated. And they play and counterplay, each trying to put the other at check and ultimately at checkmate. But you know what? There is no chance that Satan can win the very serious game of history. Jesus is going to win. You say, how do we know? Because Satan has to guess how Jesus is going to play, but Jesus already knows all of the moves that Satan is going to make so he can preempt them. It is impossible for Satan to win because he has to guess how Christ will play. And when you guess, you make mistakes. So why not live according to God's plan? Why simply not complain about things that happen in our lives that we can't understand? Things that appear negative, things that depress us. Why not simply say, Lord, I'm going to do like Joseph, I'm going to do like Esther. I can't understand everything that's happening, but your way is the best way. I'm sure when I look back, I'm going to say, wow, I'm glad that I decided to follow God's plan. Let's not whine and complain. Let's, in peace and tranquility, make the decision to follow God's plan. And as we look back, we'll say, your way was the right way. May God bless us, and may that be our experience, is my prayer.